Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are looking at a really fascinating moment today. It's about this huge power shift, almost overnight it feels like, right after World War II. How the United States went from, well, one of the big players to the global superpower. So our mission here is to dig into the sources and figure out what specific advantages the U.S. actually had, geographic, economic, military things, and maybe even more importantly, how American leaders then quickly worked to build these advantages into, well, permanent global systems, permanent rules. The starting point for all this, the real nugget, seems pretty straightforward, but it's huge. The rest of the world, especially Europe and Asia, was just devastated. That devastation was almost like necessary for the U.S. to rise like it did.
Absolutely. You have to start there. It's easy to focus just on what the U.S. did, its strengths. But the context, the unparalleled weakness of everyone else, that's just as crucial. You had this massive power vacuum because of the destruction. But it wasn't just physical damage. Britain, France, even the Soviet Union to some extent, they were financially drained, their militaries exhausted. They needed years, decades even, just to rebuild their own cities. And the U.S. was just uniquely positioned to step into that void. It really rested on three main things. First, that booming economy, totally untouched by the war on the mainland. Second, a military that had just proven itself defeating major empires. And third, the ultimate trump card, at least for a while, the atomic bomb, that nuclear monopoly.
Okay, let's unpack that first point, the industrial reality. When we say untouched, it's hard to really picture the scale of that difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
How does a country go from making tanks and planes for allies to basically running the whole global economy almost immediately?
Well, it's that geographic and industrial immunity, as historians often call it. Think about Britain, Germany, Japan, France. Their cities were rubble, their factories bombed out, transportation links shattered, huge numbers of workers lost.
Yeah.
The U.S. mainland, apart from Pearl Harbor, which was terrible but distant, was completely safe. A fortress of production, really.
So while everyone else was trying to find steel just to clear debris and maybe rebuild a bridge?
The U.S. was already churning out consumer goods, cars, appliances, everything at an ever-increasing rate. It wasn't just a head start. It was like being the only runner on the track for a while.
An industrial monopoly, effectively.
Pretty much. The war effort hadn't destroyed its base. It had massively expanded and modernized it. And that's the bedrock of the post-war boom everyone talks about. You, listening, need to grasp this. The ability to make almost anything the world needed, tractors, tools, building materials, was concentrated almost exclusively in the U.S. That gave them just enormous leverage in any negotiation.
Okay, so economic dominance based on intact industry. What about the military and tech side?
Well, American industry was vital during the war, too, obviously, through things like Lend-Lease, supplying the Allies.
So cash and carry, all that.
But the decisive moment, the thing that really announced the shift in power, was military and technological. Specifically, developing and then using the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That ended the war in the Pacific, yes, but it also demonstrated a power no one else possessed. That temporary nuclear monopoly didn't just signify military victory, it fundamentally changed the rules of international power. For a brief window, the U.S. had a weapon that put it beyond any immediate conventional challenge.
A terrifying leverage, as you said. But leadership in Washington must have known that kind of raw military dominance, especially based on a monopoly, wouldn't last forever.
Exactly. Military power is often fleeting. They realized they needed to convert that temporary advantage into something more permanent, more structural.
So they pivoted to building institutions, rules of the game.
Precisely. They focused on creating diplomatic and economic structures. The stated goal, as the sources often put it, was to prevent future wars and stabilize the global economy.
Right, which brings us to this huge institutional building project. The political side first. The United Nations, set up in 1945, obviously meant to replace the League of Nations, which had failed.
Yes, the League's failure was fresh in everyone's mind.
But here's a question I always have. The UN Security Council, with its permanent members and that veto power, wasn't that just a way for the winners of the war, especially the U.S., to bake their own power into the system, to make sure the UN couldn't really interfere with their actions?
Well, that's a very critical perspective, and there's a lot of truth to it. The U.S. learned from the League failure. Its own failure to join was key there. So this time, they made sure they were in, right at the center, with a permanent seat and that crucial veto.
So it protected their sovereignty.
Absolutely. It was about creating international order, yes, but very much on American terms. And they knew they had to move fast.
Why the rush?
The nuclear clock was ticking. The Soviets were working furiously on their own bomb. That temporary nuclear leverage had to be translated into permanent institutional arrangements before that monopoly disappeared.
Okay, so the UN sets a political framework. But you mentioned economics being just as important, maybe more so.
Arguably, yes. If the UN was the political body, Bretton Woods was the economic heart. This conference, held even before the war ended in 1944, was maybe even more significant for locking in American dominance long term. It created the big institutions we still live with, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank.
Okay, we hear those names all the time. They're meant to help stabilize economies, rebuild, prevent crises. But how exactly did setting them up cement U.S. financial control? What were a mechanism?
It was, frankly, ingenious and centered on the dollar. Before the war, currencies were notionally backed by gold, but the system was messy. Bretton Woods created what's called the gold exchange standard. Instead of every currency being convertible to gold directly, which was impractical, they did something different. They pegged the US dollar to gold at a fixed rate, $35 an ounce. Then, crucially, all other major currencies were pegged to the US dollar.
Ah, so the dollar becomes the anchor.
Exactly, the anchor for the whole global financial system. This automatically made the US dollar the world's primary reserve currency.
Meaning other countries had to hold dollars.
Yes. To conduct international trade to stabilize their own currencies, they needed large reserves of dollars. This essentially allowed the U.S. to print money that the rest of the world needed, underpinning American economic power for decades, even allowing the U.S. to run trade deficits others couldn't sustain.
Wow. So it wasn't just having the biggest factory. They designed the bank so everyone had to use their currency.
That's a good way to put it. And remember that huge industrial capacity we talked about, it needed somewhere to sell all its stuff.
Right. You need markets.
Which brings us to the third piece. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or SHACT, set up in 1947. GATT's mission was to promote free trade by pushing countries to lower tariffs and other trade barriers.
Which sounds good for everyone, doesn't it? More trade.
Well, it sounds good, but think about who benefited most immediately. The U.S., with its massive, efficient, untouched industrial base, was perfectly positioned to flood those newly opened global markets with its goods.
So it wasn't just idealism about free trade. It was also about ensuring global markets were open for American products.
It was absolutely ideological, rooted in promoting capitalism, but it also perfectly served American economic interests at that precise moment. It helped integrate the global economy, but very much under American leadership.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, though. The U.S. is busy setting up the UN, setting up Bretton Woods, pushing GATT, seemingly designing this new world order. Yet, the alliance with the Soviet Union, the partner who helped win the war, it just collapses almost instantly. Why did that happen so fast? Why did the ideological fight just overwhelm everything?
Well, the seeds of conflict were there all along, even during the war. But the fracture became unavoidable almost immediately after. Part of it was that economic architecture we just discussed. The Soviets were invited to Bretton Woods. They were offered Marshall Plan aid later.
But they refused.
They refused. They saw these institutions, probably correctly from their viewpoint, as tools designed to enforce American-style capitalism globally, something fundamentally opposed to their communist system. They saw it as economic encirclement.
And then the geopolitics kicked in hard.
Immediately. The big issue was Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference near the war's end, the Allies had agreed there would be free elections in liberated countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia.
But that didn't happen.
No. Stalin moved quickly to install communist-dominated governments across Eastern Europe. He argued it was necessary, a protective buffer zone against future German aggression, but for the West, it looked like naked expansionism.
And that's when Churchill gave his famous speech.
Yes, in 1946, warning that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent, physically and ideologically dividing Europe. That image perfectly captured the new reality. The wartime alliance was dead. A new confrontation had begun.
So the U.S. needed a response, a strategy for this new reality, which became known as containment.
Exactly. This wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction. It was a carefully developed doctrine. Policymakers, most famously George Kennan with his long telegram, argued that Soviet power was inherently expansionist but also cautious, so the U.S. strategy should be long-term, patient, but firm containment of Soviet influence, using political, economic, and, if necessary, military pressure. Not trying to roll it back everywhere immediately, but preventing its spread.
And the Marshall Plan fits right into that, doesn't it?
Perfectly. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, pumping, what was it, $13 billion, a staggering sum, then into rebuilding Western Europe.
It sounds like aid, but it was strategic.
Oh, absolutely strategic. The goal was to create prosperity and stability in Western Europe so quickly and visibly that communism would lose its appeal, make democratic capitalism look like the clear winner. And it worked. It stabilized Western European economies, fostered cooperation, and effectively drew an economic line preventing further Soviet inroads there.
So economic containment. What about the military side?
That followed quickly. The Berlin blockade and airlift in 48-49 really highlighted the military tension, and the formal response was NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in 1949.
A military alliance.
A formal military alliance, yes. The U.S., Canada, and Western European nations committing to mutual defense. If the Soviets attacked one, it was an attack on all. This was a massive departure for the U.S., a permanent peacetime military alliance committing it to European security. Unthinkable just a decade earlier.
But we have to mention the nuclear aspect again. That initial U.S. monopoly. How did that play into containment?
It was definitely part of the initial calculation, what some called atomic diplomacy. The U.S. hoped the bomb would provide leverage, perhaps make the Soviets more cautious. Probably the opposite in the long run. It certainly didn't stop them in Eastern Europe, and it deeply increased Soviet mistrust and paranoia, convincing them they absolutely had to get their own bomb as fast as possible. So, ironically, it fueled the arms race it was perhaps hoped to deter.
So let's pull back a bit. What did all this mean for the United States itself? This whole period, it just completely rewrites America's relationship with the world, doesn't it?
Fundamentally.
Utterly. The most obvious change is the definitive end of isolationism. That idea, dominant for so long that America could somehow stand apart from global conflicts. That was just gone after 1945.
Completely gone. Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion of geographic safety, and the post-war reality demanded engagement. The U.S. embraced this new role, taking on the responsibility, or maybe the burden, of leading the free world, defending democracy, maintaining order across the globe.
A permanent global role.
Permanent and active. The U.S. became, as you said, the principal architect and guarantor of the entire liberal international order for the next half-century. You saw it everywhere.
Even with former enemies?
Especially in some ways. Look at Japan. A totally defeated, devastated enemy. Under General MacArthur's occupation, the U.S. didn't just punish, it fundamentally reshaped the country.
How so, specifically?
Well, they imposed a new constitution written largely by Americans in 1946, forced the emperor to renounce his divine status, broke up the old land monopolies, and crucially included Article 9, where Japan renounces war as a sovereign right forever. It essentially demilitarized Japan and pushed it towards democracy.
Transforming an enemy into a key ally.
Exactly, a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the Pacific. It showed the extent of America's ambition to reshape the world in its image, or at least in a way compatible with its interests.
So if you sum it all up, the transformation in just, say, 1944 to 1950, it's breathtaking. From one power among several to the undisputed leader setting the rules.
It really is. Let's recap the impacts quickly. Economically, war production, followed by Reconstruction aid, fueled massive domestic growth. Bretton Woods made the dollar king.
Right.
Politically and ideologically, America sheds isolationism, embraces global leadership, builds institutions like the UN and NATO to project that leadership. And of course, this immediate division of the world with the Soviet Union sets the stage for the next 40-plus years, the Cold War. That global contest between democracy and communism defined everything.
An incredible shift, built on, as we said, that intact industry, the quick creation of those institutions, UN, IMF, World Bank, ETT, and this fundamental change in American identity towards permanent internationalism. Thanks for walking us through these sources.
My pleasure. It's a pivotal moment. And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider building on this. We talked about how U.S. power initially rested on two very specific temporary conditions, the destruction of everyone else and that nuclear monopoly. The U.S. leadership cleverly worked to translate that temporary dominance into permanent structures like the UN and the Bretton Woods system. But here's the question. If the foundation of those global rules was that initial, unique, unilateral American dominance, how stable or adaptable are those rules today now that the world is multipolar again and that original power advantage is long gone? Something to think about when you look at the strains on the international system now.